The sentence landed like a paper cut, small, precise, but impossible to ignore. 40% more for strangers. After 9 years of silent overtime, patched weekends, and systems that only stayed alive because she knew where they were fragile. HR smiled the way people do when they think numbers are neutral. She didn't argue, she didn't blink, she just nodded. And in that quiet moment, something irreversible shifted. The office always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and recycled air, like a place that had long ago traded freshness for efficiency. Rows of monitors glowed in the dim light, each screen carrying its own quiet urgency. Somewhere, a printer hummed like a tired insect. It was the kind of environment where time didn't pass. It accumulated. She had been part of that accumulation for 9 years. 9 years of knowing which server would hiccup during peak traffic. 9 years of remembering passwords no one else bothered to document. 9 years of being the invisible thread, stitching together a system that looked seamless only because she kept it from unraveling. Her name rarely came up in meetings, but her fingerprints were everywhere, buried deep in logs, scripts, and emergency patches applied at 2:17 a.m. And yet, that morning, she sat across from HR and heard a number that erased all of it. 40% more, the HR manager had said, scrolling through a spreadsheet as if it were a grocery list. That's the current market rate for new hires. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled instead, heavy, deliberate. She tilted her head slightly. New hires? Yes, came the smooth reply. It's just how the market evolves. The market evolves. It was almost poetic. Evolution, after all, rewards adaptation. But no one mentioned loyalty in that equation. Loyalty, it seemed, was a fossil. Interesting, but no longer relevant. A small pause stretched between them. HR smiled again, that practiced, reassuring smile designed to soften sharp edges. But numbers didn't soften. They cut clean. She nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a fact she had already suspected but never confirmed. And in that nod, something quiet inside her reached a conclusion. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. Clarity was colder. Back at her desk, the monitors greeted her like old acquaintances. Lines of code blinked patiently, waiting for her input. Alerts flickered at the corner of the screen. Minor anomalies, nothing urgent. The system was stable. It always was, under her watch. She placed her bag down with deliberate care, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the desk. Small details mattered. They always had. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, she considered doing what she always did, diving back in, fixing, optimizing, maintaining. Because that was the rhythm she knew, the unspoken contract. She would keep things running, and in return, what? Stability? Familiarity? Apparently not fairness. A notification popped up. A junior engineer asking for help. Again. She read the message, her eyes scanning quickly. It was a simple issue. Something she could resolve in under 5 minutes. Something she had resolved dozens of times before. Her hands didn't move. Instead, she leaned back slightly, observing the screen as if it belonged to someone else. The system would still run, she thought, for now. It always did, until it didn't. A faint murmur of conversation drifted across the office. Someone laughed. Someone else complained about deadlines. Life went on, indifferent to quiet realizations happening in corner desks. She opened a new document. The resignation letter didn't begin dramatically. No accusations, no emotional outpouring. Just a clean professional structure. Name, position, effective date. Each word felt like placing a brick, measured, intentional. Another notification blinked, then another. Her inbox was waking up. She ignored it. Instead, she reread the letter. It was concise, almost minimalist, but beneath that simplicity lay 9 years of context that didn't need to be spelled out. Anyone who understood systems would recognize it. Sometimes, the smallest changes triggered the largest consequences. She printed it. The printer, loyal as ever, obeyed without hesitation. Paper slid out smoothly, warm to the touch. She picked it up, straightened the edges, and stood. The walk to HR felt shorter than usual. Or maybe she just wasn't carrying the same weight anymore. The HR manager looked up, surprised. "Oh, back so soon?" She placed the paper on the desk. "I've reviewed the market," she said calmly. A flicker of confusion crossed the manager's face. Then realization followed, slow but unmistakable. "This is your resignation?" "Yes." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't polite or procedural. It had texture now. Uncertainty, calculation, maybe even a hint of concern. "Well," HR began carefully, "we can discuss adjustments." She shook her head, gently but firmly. "No need." Another pause. This one lingered longer, because somewhere beneath the surface, something had already begun to shift, and neither of them could quite measure it yet. She turned and walked out, her steps steady, unhurried. Behind her, the office continued its quiet hum. Screens glowed, alerts blinked, systems ran, for now. But there are always thresholds, points where stability is only an illusion, held together by knowledge that isn't easily replaced. And somewhere deep within the infrastructure, small, unnoticed dependencies waited patiently, waiting to be tested. By mid-afternoon, the office had already rewritten the story. Not officially. Nothing was ever official that fast. But in fragments, in glances, in Slack threads that started with, "Did you hear?" and ended with speculation dressed up as certainty. She left, just like that? No notice? Must have had something lined up. Narratives are comforting. They turn the unpredictable into something manageable. But the truth was far less convenient. She hadn't left for something. She had left because of something. And that distinction, subtle, almost invisible, was exactly what no one wanted to examine too closely. Her desk was still there, monitor on, chair slightly angled, a coffee mug with a faint ring at the bottom, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment, the illusion of continuity. But the system noticed first. It always does. At 14:07, a low-priority alert triggered. Nothing unusual. A slight latency spike in one of the back-end services. The kind of fluctuation that normally corrected itself within minutes. The kind she would have seen before anyone else even knew it existed. This time, it lingered. At 14:12, a second alert joined it. Different service, same pattern, still minor, still ignorable. Across the room, a junior engineer frowned at his screen. "Hey, is anyone seeing delays on the payment gateway?" "Probably just traffic," someone replied without looking up. "Give it a minute." Minutes passed. The delays didn't. By 14:26, the alerts had multiplied. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to form a pattern. A constellation of small warnings blinking across dashboards like distant stars. Individually harmless. Collectively, less so. "Did she document this?" someone asked. The question hung awkwardly in the air. Documentation existed. Of course it did. But documentation is a map, not the terrain. And she had been the terrain. At 14:41, the first real crack appeared. A service restart failed, not catastrophically, just unexpectedly. A configuration mismatch, subtle enough to slip past automated checks, but precise enough to halt the process entirely. "Okay, that's weird," the junior engineer muttered. He tried again. Same result. A senior developer rolled his chair closer, scanning the logs. "This shouldn't be happening." And yet, it was. Because somewhere, months ago, she had patched around an issue no one else had fully understood. A temporary fix that became permanent. Because temporary solutions have a habit of doing that when they work well enough. She knew why it worked. No one else did. By 1503, the office atmosphere had shifted. The hum was sharper now, conversations shorter, keyboards louder. The easy rhythm of the day had fractured into something more urgent. "Can we roll back?" someone suggested. "To what?" came the reply. Silence, because rollback requires a known good state. And suddenly, that certainty felt theoretical. Another alert, then another. Each one small, each one manageable, until they weren't. At 1517, the payment gateway slowed to a crawl. Not down, not broken, just slow enough to matter. Slow enough for users to notice. Slow enough for support tickets to start appearing. Are we under attack? No, traffic's normal. Then what is it? No one answered. Because the system wasn't failing in a way that made sense. It wasn't collapsing. It was hesitating. Like a machine trying to remember something it once knew instinctively. At 1529, someone finally said it out loud. "We need her." The words landed heavier than expected. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were accurate. HR, meanwhile, was still processing paperwork. Resignation. Effective immediately. A neat, orderly document. Easy to file. Easy to categorize. Harder to interpret. At 1542, the first service went down. Completely. The alert was no longer subtle. It was loud, unmistakable. A red signal cutting through the noise. "Okay, this is bad." The room tightened. Chairs moved closer. Screens filled with logs, metrics, guesses. Everyone searching for a pattern, a cause, a solution. But systems like this don't break randomly. They break along lines of dependency, hidden connections that only reveal themselves under stress. And she had known those lines intimately. By 1605, 3 services were unstable, not fully down, but unreliable, intermittent, unpredictable, the worst kind of failure. "Why is this cascading?" someone asked, voice edged with frustration. Because no one had mapped the cascade, because the map had left the building. A manager stepped in, trying to impose structure. "Let's prioritize. What's the root cause?" Another silence. Because root causes are easy to identify when you know where to look. At 1618, support tickets surged. Users weren't just noticing now, they were reacting. Complaints, cancellations, confusion. The external world pressing in on the internal chaos. And still no clear answer. Just fragments, clues, gaps. At 1627, someone pulled up an old internal thread, a discussion from months ago. Her name appeared repeatedly, explaining, clarifying, warning. "Did we ever fully resolve this?" the engineer asked. No one responded, because the answer was sitting in an empty chair. And outside, the sky had begun to dim, the city moving toward evening with quiet indifference. Inside, time was accelerating. By 1639, the system wasn't just slowing, it was straining. Each request taking longer, each response less certain. Like a structure under pressure, holding, but not indefinitely. And in that moment, a realization spread, not in words, but in awareness. This wasn't a glitch, this was a threshold, and they were already past it. Somewhere, miles away, she had likely already put her phone on silent. Not out of spite, but out of closure. A clean break, a necessary one, because loyalty, once measured and found lacking, doesn't negotiate. It concludes. Back in the office, screens flickered, alerts pulsed, and the system, so carefully maintained for years, began to reveal just how much of it had depended on one person's quiet expertise. Not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably. And as the first whispers of escalation reached upper management, one question finally surfaced. The one no one had wanted to ask earlier. What exactly had they just lost? The answer wasn't in the documentation, and it wasn't going to reveal itself quickly. But by morning, it wouldn't be possible to ignore. If you've ever stayed loyal to a system that quietly undervalued you, this hits differently. Have you seen something like this happen in real life? Or felt it yourself? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to see what happens next, how one quiet resignation turns into a $180 million crisis, stay with the story. Because the real consequences are only just beginning. Morning didn't arrive gently. It came with notifications. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Overnight logs stacked like unanswered questions, each timestamp marking a moment where the system had tried and failed to stabilize itself. The dashboards no longer showed patterns, they showed pressure. At 6:12, the first executive email was sent. At 6:27, the second one carried a different tone. By 6:43, escalation was no longer a discussion, it was protocol. The building, usually slow to wake, felt different that day. Lights flicked on earlier. Conversations started mid-sentence. Coffee machines worked overtime, as if caffeine alone could compensate for what was missing. In the server room, the machines hummed louder, not because they were working harder, but because someone was finally listening. At 07:05, the CTO walked in. He didn't rush. People at his level rarely do. Urgency, for them, isn't expressed through speed. It's expressed through focus, and his focus was absolute. What's the status? A simple question, no simple answer. A senior engineer stepped forward, words carefully arranged. We're experiencing cascading failures across multiple services. Payment gateway is unstable, authentication intermittent, and we've had 3 full outages since 200 hours. The CTO nodded once. Root cause? A pause. Not long, but long enough. We're still isolating it. Still isolating. The phrase hung in the air like a placeholder for something more concrete, something that wasn't there yet. He moved closer to the main screen, scanning the metrics, CPU spikes, memory inconsistencies, latency curves that looked less like data and more like warning signs. Rollback? Not viable, someone answered quickly. We don't have a clean state to revert to. Another nod. He didn't ask why, not yet, because sometimes the absence of an option is more informative than the option itself. At 07:18, a new report landed in his inbox. Subject line, Projected Impact Assessment. He opened it. Numbers filled the screen. Cold, precise, indifferent. Revenue loss per minute. Customer churn probabilities. Contractual penalties. By the third paragraph, the estimate had already crossed 8 figures. By the end, it approached something else entirely. $180 million. Not a prediction, a trajectory. He closed the report slowly, as if the act itself might change the number. It didn't. Behind him, the room continued its controlled chaos. Engineers speaking in clipped sentences, managers translating urgency into tasks, screens updating faster than anyone could fully process. Who owns this system? He asked. Another pause, shorter this time. Technically, it was a shared responsibility. Technically, a word that often appears when clarity is missing. He turned slightly. Practically? The answer came quieter. She did. No name. None was needed. Because in that moment, everyone understood exactly who she was. At 07:26, the first external call came in. A major client, one of the largest. Their systems were directly affected now, not just slowed, but disrupted. We need a timeline, the voice on speaker said, calm but firm. Timeline. The room exchanged glances, because timelines require certainty, and certainty was in short supply. We're working on it, the manager replied, choosing words with surgical care. Working on it. Another placeholder. Another delay. The call ended politely. Too politely. Because politeness, in situations like this, is often just a prelude. At 07:39, the second call came. less polite. By 0752, the third didn't bother with formalities at all. Pressure was no longer internal. It was systemic, spreading outward, affecting partners, clients, reputations. And still, the core issue remained just out of reach, like a puzzle missing a single critical piece. At 0803, someone found a clue, an old configuration file, buried deep in the system, modified months ago. No, longer. A small change, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. This doesn't match the current architecture, the engineer said. Why would it? No one answered, because the question assumed a logic that no longer applied. At 0811, they tried to replicate the change. The system reacted immediately, not with improvement, but with resistance. New errors surfaced, layered on top of the old ones. The kind of reaction that suggests the system isn't just misconfigured, it's dependent on something undocumented, something understood but never fully explained. The CTO watched silently. He wasn't looking at the code anymore. He was looking at the pattern, at the gaps, at the places where knowledge should exist, but didn't. At 0819, he asked a different question. Why wasn't this knowledge transferred? No one responded immediately, because that question didn't have a technical answer. It had a cultural one. At 0824, HR entered the room. A subtle shift. Not loud, but noticeable. I've reviewed the personnel records, the HR manager began, voice carefully neutral. Her resignation was submitted yesterday, effective immediately. Yesterday. The timeline aligned too cleanly to ignore. The CTO's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Was there an exit interview? No, HR admitted. It was declined. Declined. Another absence. Another missing piece. At 0831, the system dipped again. A sharp drop in performance. Not catastrophic, but enough to remind everyone that time wasn't on their side. The CTO exhaled slowly. Not frustration, calculation. Because by now the situation had moved beyond technical troubleshooting. It was an operational risk, a financial risk, a reputational risk, and risks at this scale demand decisions, not guesses. At 0837, he gave his first directive. Stabilize what you can. Isolate non-critical services. Reduce load. Clear, actionable, but not sufficient. Because stabilization is not resolution, it's containment. At 0842, he added a second instruction. Get me everything she worked on in the last 6 months. The room moved faster. Logs were pulled, repositories scanned, threads revisited, a digital trail reconstructed piece by piece. But reconstruction is slow, and the system was moving faster than they were. At 8:55, the realization solidified. They weren't just dealing with a failure. They were dealing with an absence of context, an absence of continuity, an absence that had been underestimated until it became impossible to ignore. The CTO looked once more at the $180 million figure. It hadn't changed, but its meaning had, because now it wasn't just a number, it was a consequence. And consequences, unlike systems, don't stabilize on their own. They escalate, quietly at first, then all at once. By mid-morning, the office no longer resembled a workplace. It felt like a control room in the middle of a storm. Every screen a wave, every alert a crack of thunder that arrived too fast to track. Containment had slowed the bleeding, but it hadn't stopped it. At 0912, a temporary fix restored partial functionality to the payment gateway. Transactions began to move again. Hesitant, uneven, like traffic after an accident. For a brief moment, relief flickered across the room. Okay, that's something, someone said. It was, and it wasn't, because 5 minutes later, a different service faltered. Authentication this time. Users logged out mid-session. Requests looped. Systems that relied on identity verification began to misfire, rejecting legitimate access while letting edge cases slip through unpredictably. Why is this shifting? An engineer asked, voice tight. Because the system wasn't broken in one place. It was misaligned everywhere, like a structure where every beam depended on the exact angle of the others. Adjust one, and the stress redistributes. Adjust another, and something else gives way. At 0926, the CTO stopped looking at individual issues. He stepped back, literally. Sometimes distance reveals what proximity hides. What are we not seeing? He asked, more to the room than to any one person. Silence answered first, then fragments. It's not a single service. It's not external. Each statement removed a possibility. None provided a solution. At 0934, someone pulled up a dependency graph, or what passed for one. It looked complete at a glance, nodes, connections, clean lines suggesting order. But as they zoomed in, the gaps became obvious. Missing links, undefined relationships, assumptions where certainty should have been. This can't be right, the engineer murmured. It wasn't, because diagrams show what's known, and she had operated in the space between what's known and what actually works. At 0941, a quiet realization surfaced. Subtle, but undeniable. They weren't just missing information. They were missing interpretation. Because the system hadn't been designed to be simple. It had been designed to be resilient. And resilience often looks like complexity, until the one who understands it steps away. At 0947, HR spoke again, carefully. We've tried contacting her. Heads turned. And no response. Of course, not out of defiance, out of finality. Because some decisions, once made, don't leave a channel open for reversal. The CTO didn't react immediately. Instead, he asked, what exactly did she handle? A dangerous question, because the answer wasn't a list. It was a network. She maintained the core integrations, someone began, and the failover logic, another added, and the legacy bridge between old and new systems, and a lot of undocumented fixes. A lot. The phrase expanded as it was spoken. Because each person remembered a piece. None remembered the whole. At 10:02, the system dipped again, sharper this time. Not a collapse, but close enough to feel it. Support queues surged, clients escalated, internal channels filled with urgency that no longer tried to hide behind professionalism. This is becoming visible, a manager said. It already was. At 10:11, the CTO made a decision. Stop chasing symptoms. The room stilled. We're not fixing this one error at a time. We're rebuilding context. Rebuilding context. It sounded abstract. It wasn't. It meant retracing logic, reconstructing intent, understanding not just what the system did, but why it did it that way. And that takes time they didn't have. At 10:19, they began. Teams split, not by service, but by history. Who remembered what? Who had worked on which part? Who had seen which anomaly months ago and dismissed it because she handled it? Fragments became threads. Threads became hypotheses. But hypotheses don't stabilize systems. They test them. At 10:33, one hypothesis led to a breakthrough, a hidden dependency, subtle, elegant, and completely undocumented, a fallback mechanism that only activated under specific conditions, conditions that now, under stress, were occurring simultaneously across multiple services. She built this as a safeguard, the engineer said, almost impressed. A safeguard? Yes, but safeguards require understanding. Without it, they become triggers. At 10:41, they adjusted the configuration. Carefully. Deliberately. The system responded, not with failure, with hesitation. Then slowly, metrics began to shift. Latency decreased. Errors reduced. Not gone, but less. A ripple of cautious optimism moved through the room. Is it holding? Someone asked. Too early to tell, because systems like this don't recover instantly. They test stability, they probe for weaknesses, and if anything remains misaligned, they find it. At 10:52, the CTO looked at the dashboards again, still unstable, but trending. For the first time that day, the curve wasn't entirely against them. He didn't smile, but the tension in the room shifted, just enough to notice. At 11:03, another call came in, the same major client. Status? This time the answer was different. We've identified a core issue. Stabilization is in progress. Not a promise, but closer. The call ended with less friction than before. A small victory. But in systems under pressure, small victories matter. At 11:17, the system held. Not perfectly, but consistently. Enough to breathe, enough to think. And in that space, brief, fragile, the real understanding began to form. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was a structural one, a failure of visibility, of knowledge transfer, of assumptions left unchallenged because everything had worked until it didn't. The CTO finally spoke what everyone was beginning to realize. We didn't lose a person. A pause. We lost a system of understanding. The distinction mattered, because replacing a person is a process. Replacing understanding, that's something else entirely. And as the system steadied, temporarily cautiously, the larger consequence came into focus. This would not end today. Stability, once fractured, demands more than quick fixes. It demands change, deep, uncomfortable, necessary change. And those changes were only just beginning to surface. By early afternoon, the system had stopped fighting them. It wasn't fully stable, far from it, but the sharp, unpredictable swings had softened into something more measurable. Metrics still fluctuated, but now they did so within boundaries that engineers could anticipate, analyze, and, most importantly, influence. Control, partial, fragile, was returning, and with it, clarity. At 12:08, the war room had quieted, not because the problem was solved, but because the chaos had evolved into focus. Conversations were lower, more precise. No one wasted words anymore. Every sentence carried weight. A senior engineer leaned back, eyes fixed on the dashboard. We're not chasing ghosts anymore. No, they were tracing intent, and intent leaves patterns. At 12:17, another piece fell into place. A sequence of fallback routines, layered, interdependent, almost architectural in design. Not something patched together under pressure, but something constructed with foresight. She didn't just fix things, someone said quietly. She anticipated them. The realization settled deeper this time. Because anticipation doesn't show up in performance reviews. It doesn't translate cleanly into metrics. But when it's gone, the absence is unmistakable. At 12:29, the CTO stood near the main screen, arms crossed, watching the system breathe. He wasn't looking for errors anymore. He was looking for shape. How long until full stabilization? He asked. A measured pause. Best case? Several hours. Worst case? The engineer hesitated. We're looking at a phased recovery over days. Days. In a system where minutes had already cost millions. The number didn't surprise him, but it recalibrated the stakes. At 12:36, Finance sent an updated report. The projected loss had shifted, not because the system was fixed, but because the trajectory had changed. The curve had flattened slightly, no longer accelerating toward worst-case scenarios. Still massive, still unacceptable, but no longer uncontrollable. He closed the report without comment. because numbers at this stage were symptoms. The cause was elsewhere. At 12:44, HR reappeared, more cautiously this time. "We've prepared a retention analysis," the manager began, voice careful, almost subdued. "There are discrepancies in compensation across multiple teams." Discrepancies. A sterile word for something that had just cost them millions. The CTO didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked, "How many?" "Significant enough to require review." Another pause. Because review implies time. And time, in this context, had already proven expensive. At 12:51, he gave a short nod. "Start it." Not approval, a directive. Because some actions don't wait for consensus. They follow consequence. At 13:02, the system stabilized further. Not perfectly, but predictably. And predictability, in complex systems, is a form of control. Engineers began to test cautiously, introducing small changes, observing responses, confirming hypotheses that had formed under pressure. Each success added confidence. Each anomaly refined understanding. They were rebuilding, not just functionality, but knowledge. At 13:19, the first service returned to full capacity. A quiet milestone, no applause, just a collective exhale. Because progress here wasn't celebrated, it was measured. At 13:27, the CTO finally stepped away from the screens. Not far, just enough to think without the constant flicker of data. Because the technical problem, while not solved, was now contained. What remained was systemic. He looked out through the glass wall of the office. Employees moving, talking, working. Some aware of the crisis, others only sensing its aftershocks. A functioning organization, on the surface. But beneath that surface, something had been exposed, not by failure alone, but by absence. At 13:34, he spoke again, quieter this time. "This doesn't happen in isolation." No one disagreed, because systems, technical or human, reflect their structures. And this structure had revealed a flaw, not in code, in priorities. At 13:41, HR stood a little straighter, as if anticipating what came next. "We'll need to reassess compensation frameworks, knowledge transfer protocols, and—" "Yes," he interrupted, not dismissive, decisive. "All of it." The words landed with clarity, because partial fixes weren't enough anymore. Not after this. At 13:49, another update came in. Customer impact was stabilizing, complaints slowing, systems responding. Externally, the crisis was beginning to recede. Internally, it was just beginning to take shape. At 13:56, someone asked the question that had been building all day. "Should we try to bring her back?" The room stilled, not out of surprise, but because the question forced a different kind of thinking. Not technical, human. The CTO considered it. Not long, just enough. "No," he said finally. A few heads turned, not in disagreement, in curiosity. "Why?" someone asked carefully. He didn't look at them. He looked back at the system. Because this wasn't her failure to stay. A pause. It was ours. The distinction settled heavily, because it removed the simplest solution and replaced it with a harder one. Change. Real change. At 14:03, the system held steady. For the first time since the previous day, it felt reliable. Not perfect, but trustworthy enough to move forward. Engineers began documenting, not just fixes, but reasoning, not just actions, but intent, writing things down that until now had lived only in understanding. A quiet shift, but a critical one. At 14:17, the CTO received one final update. "Core system stable, monitoring ongoing." He nodded once, not satisfied, but resolved. Because stability isn't the end of a story like this, it's the beginning of accountability. And as the office slowly transitioned back toward something resembling normal, one truth remained. Clearer than any metric, sharper than any report. The system had survived, but the illusion hadn't. And once illusions break, they don't rebuild themselves the same way again.